The Emilia Romagna Grand Prix returned once more to the Grand Prix calendar with the Autodromo Enzo E. Dino Ferrari circuit home to, well, a hectic weekend of racing. The first sprint race of the season, the first of three in their new tweaked format for this year, and rain came together for, quite the Grand Prix on Sunday, and thank goodness for that, because it gives us plenty to discuss. The recording date is Monday, the 25th of April, and to discuss all things Imola alongside myself, Harry Benjamin, I'm joined by F1 commentator for the likes of Channel 4 and the BBC, Ben Edwards, and I'm also pleased to say European sports car champion and F2 and F3 commentator Alex Brundle joins us on the show this week. Welcome both. Alex, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. First of all, thoughts on the season so far? We'll obviously discuss Imola, but it's been a bit of a busy start to the Formula One season in 2022.
Well, the regulation change was always going to lead to a mix-up in the field. It was always going to lead to some winners and some losers. I think the most interesting thing for me in the season so far, how the new regulation set are rewarding the core competencies of the various teams, and those groups are managing to get their head around it. We've seen, the clear improvement, or the clear dominance, I would say, of Red Bull and Ferrari, which has ebbed and flowed through the first few races. But behind that, a real scattergun of different performances from teams like McLaren, getting it together one weekend, Alfa Romeo getting it together another weekend. And of course, across the garages as well, drivers working with their engineers to make those critical big movements up and down the field, which has been fascinating to watch technically.
It certainly has. And at the moment, well, we've just finished, as I said, a hectic weekend in Imola, Ben, and the first of the sprint races that we are going to be seeing a couple more of this year. How did you... what were your initial thoughts coming into this about the sprint? I know we spoke about it last week as well, but was it how you expected it to go? Obviously, it sort of replaces the traditional qualifying, but we do also still get that. But it certainly, with the changeable conditions, it proved quite entertaining.
Well, it did. Of course, actually, the sprint race was more entertaining in some ways than the Grand Prix because you had people moving up. And I think the thing is, of course, the danger is when you have a qualifying like you had on Friday afternoon, as we did, which was a bit unpredictable, and you had a few people out of position, particularly Carlos, for example, Sergio, out of position. So that made the sprint race really quite exciting because those guys had to fight their way up, and we had a battle for the lead. The trouble was, when we got into the race, everyone was sort of in position. And so we didn't quite end up with that same battle that we might have enjoyed in the Grand Prix in the early stages. Mind you, of course, we had some dramas. We lost Sainz, we lost Ricciardo in the Grand Prix itself, and I think that was a bit of a downer. So there are pros and cons to this whole sprint mechanism. I was actually watching from the sidelines this time. Wasn't working on the Grand Prix myself this weekend, so I like doing that sometimes. It's just nice to see it as a fan. And of course, I found myself getting tied up on Friday afternoon in qualifying, and definitely wanting to see the sprint race, really enjoying it. Having an extra race, and I could feel for the Tifosi having that opportunity to see an extra race. So there are a lot of positives by having a sprint race. But there are some negatives as well. So, and we did lose out, I think, a little bit in the Grand Prix itself in terms of some of the excitement.
Yeah, Alex, it's interesting, isn't it? A lot of people saying, the drivers certainly, I think, are still very mixed in their opinions on if they like the sprint as well. Particularly, of course, if you do find yourself out of position, or if something happens to you during the sprint race, then, that kind of ruins your Grand Prix Sunday quite possibly. But Ross Brawn wants to double the amount next year in 2023. Is that something you want to see?
It's interesting. We did see the field reshuffled into a more normal order through the sprint race, but there were drivers who were still out of position at the start of the Grand Prix. I'd highlight Carlos Sainz as being one of those who then struggled early on and still managed to have that, pretty much an unfortunate incident actually from his perspective with Daniel Ricciardo. But the drivers are calling for those events to be more standalone rather than actually setting the grid for Grand Prix Sunday. And that's a very interesting concept. What we basically end up with then is more of a Formula 2 event. They clearly like the concept. They want to go racing. From a driver's perspective, and I think we saw this over that battle at the front of the field, drivers must be driving with the race on Sunday in the back of their mind, and that can't be that enjoyable from inside the cockpit to want to make the move, to want to go charging through, to want to defend hard and show the Tifosi what you're made of if, for example, you're Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari, but always knowing that if you overstep, you've got a long Grand Prix Sunday to think about it, starting at the back of the field. So I would really be supportive of the sprint race becoming its own thing, becoming its own entity, and delivering points perhaps all the way down the field. That would be exciting for me.
Yeah, of course. Well, in this rejig format, it's the top 8, isn't it, who get points? Ben, is that something you'd sort of be in favour for as well?
Having a complete sprint weekend, yeah, I think that might be an interesting option to go down that route, and sort of separating the two pieces might work very well. I think the trouble is, I can just imagine that the TV viewing numbers are going to go up, with people watching both Saturday and Sunday because they're watching races on 2 days, and that's going to put pressure on Formula One in a way to carry on that sort of thing rather than back off, although some of the teams will be against it. So I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion, shall we say, going forward. Yeah.
And certainly, I think we said last week as well, it's more bang for your buck if you're a fan in the stands as well. It's more racing action that you get to see track side. So, you're winning out there too. Well, that was all the action even before we got to Sunday. And the Grand Prix, Ben, it turned out to be a bit of a masterclass in the end for Max Verstappen and Red Bull. Max Verstappen, we should say, has just won or been voted the Laureus World Sportsman of the Year as well, which is quite impressive, beating lots of other candidates from other completely different sports. But what did you make of the general action, Ben, first off, from the Grand Prix on Sunday?
It was a lot about the start, wasn't it? And it was interesting. It was the cars on the left-hand side that actually definitely made the better start. I think that it was quite interesting because I think in the dry, on a normal dry surface, you'd probably be better off on the right because there's a bit more rubber down on the right. But because it was wet, damp, that was a bit more slippery on the right, and the cars on the left definitely made the better getaway. That worked really well for Max, worked brilliantly for Lando, who actually got off the line beautifully as well. It wasn't just that he was in the right place. And that sort of centered it really with the fact that Perez managing to squeeze past as well, and the battle between Perez and Leclerc through the race was very interesting. I was disappointed by the Leclerc mistake. We talked the other day about how people have said he's matured and he's taken another step up. Actually, this weekend we saw the bit of Leclerc that we have seen before making these errors, which was totally unnecessary at that point. And particularly when you're fighting for a world championship, you don't want to do that. He was very lucky not to lose all the points and get that car back in to the finish. So I hope he's really learned from this one, because to me that was daft. He didn't need to do that.
It's really a red mist mistake, wasn't it? It just got caught up in the moment. He was chasing after Perez. That Ferrari has a really pointy little front end on it. You could see that as soon as he came out of the pit lane. I noticed exiting Toza, all of a sudden, as soon as he put that soft tyre on, a short shift through the gears came into Leclerc's driving as he tried to keep the rear under control. And I think that, mixed with the fact that he had this red mist of having to get up the field, having to make that pass on Perez, made him basically overcommit the car into the Variante Alta. But I completely agree, Ben. That's the moment, isn't it? That's the moment when a driver like Lewis Hamilton, who's having an absolutely terrible year so far, but in that car might have just managed the situation slightly better.
Yeah, I think so. And I think actually Max has got that maturity to him. We're seeing that a bit more. The way that he's just giving a little bit more space sometimes now when they're battling. Having got that one title under his belt, I think he's going to be even harder to beat this year. And the fact that they've got that pace, as we saw this weekend, it does make for a very interesting year, I have to say. It really does.
It's interesting, though, seeing the narrative coming out from the Ferrari camp as well, because it really wasn't a great day for Ferrari on home soil in the end, from what could have been, potentially a double podium. Carlos Sainz, spectacularly fast, Alex, but once again, not his fault, being taken out into Tamburello by Daniel Ricciardo, basically beached in the gravel in the end, wasn't he? But it was interesting seeing that Mattia Binotto, the team principal, saying that Carlos has to manage the pressure of racing a front-running car, particularly also a mistake in qualifying, pushing in the changeable conditions. And then conversely, we're seeing him saying, well, actually, we slate Leclerc there, as Ben was saying, a daft decision, and he was lucky to get away with the minimal damage going into the wall. But, they don't regret saying to Leclerc, push now to try and get the position back. So are we starting to see a little bit of, well, okay, here's that 1 and 2 coming back in now, Leclerc number 1, Sainz number 2?
I mean, it's still quite a young lineup at Ferrari, and I watched the camera descend over the front of the grid as red smoke was pouring from the grandstand along the front straight, and I just thought, wow, yeah, that's quite something to line up in front of as one of the 2 young Ferrari drivers in the field. And I think it affected their mindset, and everybody talks about the pressure when you go to Ferrari and what it's like to walk in. Remember, we join these weekends, camera cuts, we talk about them for a bit, and then the camera jumps and they're on the grid. But they've lived it from when they've arrived. Every little Italian child who's come up to them and wanted a hug, wanted their autograph, everyone who screamed and yelled and desired their attention, it builds to a climax. And I think that is what, the team principal of Ferrari is talking about there. It is tough. It is hard to do. That's why it all becomes a psychological challenge at the front of the field. But both of them throughout the weekend made an avoidable error that essentially ended their chance of victory. And I think they'll both have to go home and look at perhaps their mindset through the weekend, look at the things that they've allowed into their Grand Prix, into their world, into their racing world, and decide if they need all of them and if some of those things have had a detrimental effect on their performance.
Certainly. Well, if we look at someone who else was involved in that incident that put Sainz out, was obviously Daniel Ricciardo. McLaren, though, back on the podium in the hands of his teammate Lando Norris, Ben, which it's really hard to sort of pinpoint exactly where we think McLaren are at the moment. Disastrous start to the year, now on the podium, but once again, though, the common theme here is that Lando Norris is once again outshining Daniel Ricciardo.
Yeah, it is. We didn't actually get a really clear picture of Daniel because of what happened right on that opening lap. So it's a difficult one to read whether Daniel would have had a good race. It was a tiny error on his behalf. It was nice to see him actually go over to the Ferrari hospitality suite and apologise to Carlos. That was a nice thing to see. But as a team, you're absolutely right. I think they're incredibly unpredictable at the moment. Lando's doing a brilliant job. I mean, he really is at a top level at the moment. He and George Russell, great rivals growing up, of course. They're both delivering fantastically well for their respective teams. But I do think McLaren is still a bit unpredictable in terms of, are we going to see them best of the rest, behind that group, which is really Ferrari, Red Bull, very much at the top. Mercedes maybe there, but at the moment not. And so is McLaren the best team there? I'm not sure we're going to see that every time, because sometimes the Alpine is really strong. And sometimes we're seeing, Alfa Romeo strong, for example. So I think McLaren have got a good car, but I think it might be on quite a narrow line, making it work, and at particular circuits. We'll have to see if they can get that better as they develop it.
Well, certainly one to watch, isn't it? Conversely, a team, still bizarre to talk about them, Alex, isn't it? In such a low light for Mercedes. Mixed fortunes, though. I actually predicted last week George Russell to be on the podium. Oh, so close, but proving that
Very
he's
close.
turned from, we called him Mr. Saturday. Now he's a bit more Mr. Consistent. His results, 4th, 5th, 3rd, 4th, and Lewis Hamilton finishing down in 14th, couldn't get past Gasly or Albon. So it was actually a really good run for Russell to get up to 4th. But once again, just Hamilton saying each weekend, it's a rescue. What's going on there? Why is Hamilton finding this car so much more difficult than George?
Well, I watched it bounce its way down to Tamburello all the way through the weekend, thinking that just looks so tricky and tough to drive. My experience of cars that porpoise, and unfortunately I have had a lot with the amount of time I've spent in sports cars, is that a lot of the noise that the car is making is noise that you can ignore. And some drivers can ignore it and some drivers can't. The Mercedes quite clearly, again, you look at the competencies of the team and the Mercedes were incredible with their rear ride height management throughout the end of last year. And in many ways were in a good position irrespective of the fact they lost quite a lot of aerodynamic time, tunnel time, CFD time to the way the regulations are set up now. But they had run a low rate car all the way through last year. They had practice in how to seal the floor, and I think they're just overconfident in their control of the ride height using the suspension, the much reduced suspension elements that are now available to the teams. When you watch the Ferrari comb the deck all the way around the circuit, the ride height control of it is absolutely spectacular. The Mercedes just looks absolutely the opposite of that. I think George, bizarrely, because he's had to scrap a bit in the Williams, is potentially in a position where he's jumping in that Mercedes, trying to make his mark. If it hits the floor all the way down to Tamburello, he's going to break at 80 metres anyway. Whereas Lewis has been in a position over the last few years where he gets the car he needs to win the race, or comes in the pits, tells the team it's not the car he needs to win the race, they fix it, and then he carries on. And I think those are diametrically opposed flight paths into that Mercedes car, which is why George potentially is making a better showing of himself while the car is difficult, but maybe Lewis Hamilton will be the key to rescuing that car before the end of the year.
I think that's a very good point, and I tend to agree with you, where George is used to driving a car that is down at the lower end, but scrabbling at something out of it, just getting something out of it. And I think you're right, the mindset is different to a world champion who's got a very different sort of thought on what do I need to do now, what do I need from the car, and it may be even looking after the car a bit more is what gets you points. So yeah, I totally agree with you on that, Alex. I think interesting the differences between the cars that you're talking about. One of the things that struck me a little bit was that straight line speed of the Williams. You know, the fact that Alex Albon was able to stay ahead of Gasly and Hamilton. And even when the DRS opened up, the fact that he had that straight line speed with that Williams makes me think when they go to Monza, they might actually have quite a good car there, mightn't they?
Yeah, we've seen Williams. Well, we went through a phase last year of deciding that Williams had a kind of car for special conditions, because they every so often would really turn up, wouldn't they, with George Russell? I think it might have just been a bit of a special qualifying performance from George Russell, but there were several cars that really nailing it in a straight line. The Red Bull out front, and then various different cars. I have to look through the speed trap data because it's actually quite interesting to see how they're all making their performance, because as with often when you have a big regulatory change, there's a big diversity in where the performance is coming. But yes, get the skinny wings on it and let's see what it does in Italy a little bit later on in the year.
Yes, a return to Italy as well. Once again, 2 on the calendar, 1 in Monza as well on the way. Now, I know it is early on in the season, and we'll be saying this until, I don't know, when we get to maybe Silverstone, then we can start to say, actually, no, is it the time to then start to focus on next year? When do Mercedes cut their losses?